Hi, I'm Ted Pattison from Critical Path Training. In this video, we're going to talk about the introduction of claims-based security and how it affects security and configuration of SharePoint. Well, if we look back at SharePoint 2003, well, we had a security model which was tightly coupled with Active Directory and Windows accounts. So it was impossible for all practical purposes to authenticate against any other system. And for an intranet style application, well, that was fine because typically a company already had hundreds or thousands of users who already had Active Directory accounts. And so having those users be able to authenticate against their Windows accounts and be able to use SharePoint and be able to configure permissions was no problem. However, in cases where I wanted users that didn't live inside of Active Directory, it got to be a very hard fit. So luckily in SharePoint 2007, because ASP.NET 2.0 added in the whole architecture for ASP.NET authentication providers, SharePoint was able to support forms-based authentication, or FBA. So instead of having my users inside of Active Directory, I could create a simple SQL database and have my usernames and passwords saved inside that. Now, it was nice being able to break free of Active Directory as we moved to 2007, but we have a lot of other issues. For instance, trying to have Live ID be my authentication system and having SharePoint recognize authenticated users from Live ID and be able to give away permissions has been quite a challenging undertaking that requires quite a bit of code. Now, there are a lot of other scenarios that really make these new improvements, very valuable. Now, one big benefit of the new claims-based model is it's going to further decouple SharePoint Foundation from the authentication provider. SharePoint has never done the authentication. It's always relied on Windows and IIS or FBA to do it. However, there's still been some tight coupling. So by adding a new claims-based model, it further removes us from a tight coupling to authentication providers, making it easy to just configure other authentication providers like Live ID with declarative entries as opposed to writing lots of code to get there. Now, we have this other problem in SharePoint 2007. Let's say that I have a site and I have both Windows authenticated users and FBA users who both need to get there. Well, inside of SharePoint 2007, to configure both Windows authentication and FBA to the same site means you need two different zones. Basically, two different IIS websites, two different web.config files, which means that there has to be different URLs. Wouldn't it be nice if your Windows authenticated users and your FBA users could basically hit the same URL to hit the same site? So claims-based authentication is going to make that possible. One of the main motivations for Microsoft starting to add claims-based support into SharePoint was to support federation. So federation is a set of technologies that support emerging SOA security standards so that one organization can have a set of users, and by creating a path of trust between different organizations, one organization can authenticate another organization's users and configure authorized access. And so everything about claims-based security is allowing SharePoint to kind of embrace the federation that we can set up with Windows Server 2008 R2. Some of the other things about claims-based security is that in SharePoint 2007, well, we have this idea of a Active Directory distribution list. And while SharePoint 2007 to some degree recognizes what a distribution list is, it's not a first-class security object. It would be impossible for you to configure a list so that you provide access only to people in a certain distribution list. With claims, there is the potential to create a claims provider that would recognize users inside of the distribution list in such a way that you could now create access control lists based on that. And as people start creating more claims providers, what we'll see is that claims providers can feed the people picker that we're used to in SharePoint. Today, it shows us our Active Directory accounts or maybe FBA accounts, but as people start creating custom claims providers, the sky's the limit as far as how easy we can make it for users to provide authorized access and to configure access control lists on objects. Now, there's a lot of terminology when we get to claims. Well, there's the identity. There's the identity which points to typically a security principle, such as Brian C., the user. Now, Brian C. has a Windows account. And when we use Windows authentication, we create a Windows security token. So, in many ways, conceptually, that's a claim. You have a Windows security token that's claiming that there is a user named Brian C. and that this particular thread of execution wants to execute something on his behalf. What we'll see is we'll have identities in claims-based security. It's just they won't be identified by Windows security tokens. They'll be identified by a new XML-based token created with a language called SAML, Security Access Markup Language. Now, an identity can have a claim. Now, once again, to make the analogy back to a Windows security token, a Windows security token might make the claim that Brian C. is in an Active Directory group called engineers. And so as Brian tried to access something, the system will allow it by seeing that he's in a particular group. The problem with the claim inside the Windows security token is it's not extensible. If I wanted to have a claim that Brian was over 18 or Brian has been with the company for more than 5 years, there's no way to extend the Windows security token so it recognizes these things or to create any type of approach to configure access control based on these extended claims. What's nice about this new architecture is that these SAML tokens can be extended in any arbitrary fashion to support any claim. Now, you're going to have an issuer, some party that creates the claim. You're going to have a security token, which, like a Windows security token, is going to have an identity and some type of claims about that. It's created in a new language called Security Access Markup Language, which is going to be understood across systems. And there's a whole host of cryptography technologies where we can take the SAML token and digitally sign it and send it to someone else. And as long as that other party trusts us, they're going to believe what they see in the claim and provide access to resources based on those claims. Now you have an issuing authority that knows about the claims desired by the target application, and so it can create these security tokens on demand. Now, inside of claims-based security and inside of SharePoint, we're going to see that there's something called the Security Token Service. That's something that's going to build, sign, and issue security tokens. And one of the things that the Security Token Service inside of SharePoint has the ability to do is to see the Windows security token associated with Brian C., the user, and automatically convert that to a claims-based identity, a SAML token, and the claims will be the same. It's claiming that there's a Windows user named Brian C., and he's in a particular group. It's just that the claims architecture allows us to put, many other types of claims. And then there's this terminology of the relying party. That's the application that's believing the claim and that has authorization access configured in terms of that claim. Now, if we look at a basic architecture of two scenarios that use claims-based security, one is where I have a smart client, possibly a Silverlight application or a Windows Forms application that's trying to get to a resource behind a web service, and the web service has locked something down with claims. And so the smart client can make a call or can configure behaviors such that when it wants to get to a resource, it's going to pull back a policy telling it what type of claim it needs and where to go and get that claim. So after getting the policy, the smart client would know to call out to possibly another web service out on the network that has a security token service, an STS. The security token service might authenticate the user or might leverage the fact that that user has already been authenticated from Windows and something like an Active Directory domain controller. But what's going to happen is the STS will then, by finding something out and having some level of trust, will then build the claim that that application needs as a SAML token, sign it, and send it back to the smart client application, which could then send the claim to the relying party. The relying party then is going to look at the claim and see that the claim that is needed to access this resource is inside there. It sees that the signature on the SAML token was created by this security token service across the network that the relying party trusts, and so it's going to provide access. Now, in a browser scenario, well, we can't make a web service call and get policy. So typically what happens is that when a request is made, if that claim isn't there, there's a piece of JavaScript that redirects the browser out to the security token service on the network, and it is able to acquire the claim and automatically redirects the browser back. Now inside of SharePoint, there probably won't be as much redirection because the STS is built right into SharePoint and runs in process. So what can happen inside of SharePoint is the request comes in, and in process they can look at a Windows security token and convert that to a claims-based identity, and then basically give away access to resources based on the claims made inside there. Now in SharePoint 2010, there's two scenarios. The easier one that we'll cover first is incoming claims. The more complicated one, for more advanced development scenarios, is dealing with outgoing claims. Now, if we look at this picture, what we see is that SharePoint is entirely decoupled from the authentication provider. So we have an authentication provider, or what we might call an identity provider, such as a Windows user who would be authenticated with an Active Directory domain controller. We have Live ID, maybe we're using FBA, maybe we're using Federation. But as that user comes to the SharePoint site, what SharePoint wants to see is a claims-based identity. And so the first thing it will do is see the request, and it will forward the request to the SharePoint security token service. It can then take that Windows identity and convert it to a claims identity. And if the resource that we want to access doesn't just want to see that Brian C., the user, can get to the resource, or that Brian's in an Active Directory group, maybe the claim that we need is that Brian is over 18 years old, or Brian has been with the company for 5 years. So we might have a custom claims provider that's called upon. And the custom claims provider can first of all find out some type of guarantee about the identity in hand. Maybe it will say, okay, well I see we have Brian C., and we trust the authentication provider, so we know that's really the user Brian C., and so maybe the claims provider will go look up some information in the SAP system, and it will find out information about whether Brian is really over 18 or whether Brian has been with the company for 5 years. And from that information, that custom claims provider can then write into the claim whatever particular attribute we want. So let's say that the claims provider saw that it was Brian C. It went to the SAP Human Resources module. It then found some type of data telling it that Brian had been with the company 5 years or more. And so it writes into its own SAML token that the claim is that this user has been with the company 5 years or more. And then it returns the SAML token back to SharePoint that can then use that SAML token to access a particular resource. Now, one of the nice things about this model is, let's say that you've been working with SharePoint and you've been configuring security or programming security. Well, there's this notion of an SP user object. And SP users, examples of those are Windows users, FBA users, but it's not just users that resolve to SP users, but it's basically external security principals. For instance, an Active Directory group is seen in the SharePoint security model as an SP user. An FBA role is seen as an SP user. And all the things that we do inside the site to configure security is done in terms of the SP user. What's nice about the new model is every claim is seen as an SP user object. So the code you've written to take an SP user object and configure access to a particular list or document library, or to add it to a particular SharePoint group, that doesn't change. We just see a new type of SP user object. Now, outgoing claims are going to be far more complicated and are going to be less common that we have to think through these. But if you're someone who takes on the challenge of creating a service application, well, you're going to have to know claims pretty well. So what's going to happen is there's going to be a call that comes into the front-end web server, and possibly there's a web part. And that web part then calls to the proxy of your service application, and that call then goes from the front-end web server to where your service application lives on an application server. Now, all communications from the front-end web server through the proxy to an application service in the back have to go through WCF, Windows Communication Foundation. And as such, they can use claims. Well, let's say that the request comes in, and on the front-end web server, there's a Windows security token for Brian C. that's converted over to a claims-based identity for Brian C. Well, that SAML token can simply be passed from the web service client proxy over to the application service. Your application, your service application, can then use that SAML token to decide whether to give access to a particular resource. It would also be possible using the Geneva framework to take that SAML token, which recognizes Brian as the principal behind a Windows account, and using the Geneva framework, there's an API that allows you to take the SAML token and convert it back to a Windows security token so that you could call across the network and connect to a database under Brian's Windows identity. You could also take the SAML token and pass it to a back-end system. But being able to understand claims and convert one claim to another, or convert a claims-based identity to a Windows-based identity, are going to be the kind of things that we have to think through as we're creating code inside of service applications. Now, one big benefit of configuring claims is that it's going to be a lot easier for users as they look at the people picker, as we'll see in the demo just ahead. Okay, so here on my development workstation, I'm going to start by opening up the central administration application. Now note that with Beta 2, you might never recognize that claims are available for you to work with, because you might just have web applications that are created in classic mode. If I go to the page for managing web applications, and I decide to create a new web application, one of the things that we'll see is that when you create a new web application, you make a choice to bring it and create it in classic mode authentication, which is going to be just like we have with 2007 when we're configuring Windows authentication, or we can go into claims-based authentication mode. If I go into claims-based authentication mode, one thing that we'll note is that we're still creating a web application and configuring the default zone, but the default zone can allow for Windows authentication and ASP.NET FBA, and if I have other trusted identity providers, I could add those in as well. Now, let's go see how we create one of these trusted identity providers. Back inside of Central Administration, let's go click on the Security tab, and notice that there is a link for Manage Trusts. If I click on Manage Trusts, well, there is the Trusted Service Consumer. That's the only one that's there by default. Let's say that I wanted to add in the ability to authenticate against Live ID and have those Live ID users recognized as authenticated users inside this web application. I'm going to click on New, and I'm going to create a new trust. And so this would be Live ID, and then there would be a root certificate that Live ID uses. By adding this root authority certificate in, what I'm basically doing is I'm saying I trust the Live ID system. When they authenticate users and they basically send me a SAML token and it's signed, I'm going to basically say if it's signed with this particular key, I trust that if they authenticate the user, I recognize them and I trust they are who they say they're going to be. But now, instead of writing lots of code to integrate with external identity providers like Live ID, it's simply going to be uploading a certificate and possibly providing other things, such as, who is our farm trust right here. Okay, so once again, let me exit here. Let's go back to create a new web application. And so as I create a new web application, let's say I've configured Live ID as an external identity provider. Well, if I pick claims, I'm going to be able to go down and say, as you hit my web application, you can authenticate with Windows and/or with Forms and/or with, and Live ID will be a choice down here. Also note, if I go a little bit down below, there's going to be a single entry point for as many authentication providers as I want to put in. So now we have the ability to have a sign-in page. So I could create a sign-in page that when you get to my particular site, I could say, click here to sign in using your Windows account and Windows authentication. Click here to sign in with FBA. Click here to sign in with Live ID. Okay, now you've seen some of the basics of how we configure this authentication. Now what I want to do is let's bring up two different web applications. Inside we have our intranet, which is using your classic mode with Windows authentication. And if I decide that I want to add some new users, let's say I want to go to Site Permissions, so that I can go ahead and create some new permissions. And now here is the typical people picker that I see when I look for Windows accounts. So notice I can come through here and I can see, I can basically search for people named Brian. So there's an example of the people picker from classic mode. Well, let's cancel out of this. Now let's go over to a different web application. This web application is configured to use claims. So this time, I'll go to Site Settings and we'll go ahead and we'll create a new user. And this time, when we add a user, remember that I can add in, just like in Windows, a Windows user or an Active Directory group. But now, here's the claim-based people picker. If I come up here and I say Brian, notice that this dialog is being filled with all the claims providers. If I go ahead and do a search, well, it's finding two Active Directory users, but if there were Forms users who were inside there, I would see those as well. If I had Live ID plugged in here, I would be able to see Live ID users. Furthermore, if we created a custom claims provider and our claims provider had claims such as users who have been in the company for more than 5 years or users who are over 18, the custom claims provider could populate this and actually give me a hierarchy to let me drill down and pick those various claims, making it very easy for me to add and configure access control lists. So once again, as I step through and I kind of introduce the fundamental concepts of claims-based security, the basic move we have here is to further decouple SharePoint from the authentication provider, the component that provides the identity, so that we can easily configure SharePoint against any number of authentication providers. It also allows us to take this notion of an access control list and start configuring it with things that are far more flexible than a username or a group name into any arbitrary claim that I want.